We come to the middle of Ritual 6, and we're trying to appreciate something which is difficult for us for several reasons. We're limiting ourselves to ritual. And almost never in civilization is ritual given its own portion marked off so that its form of objectivity is distinct. Usually it's confused with the mind. Symbols, as we will see, are generated out of rituals, constellated out of language, out of feeling, out of experience. And they're generated ritually and constellated mythically, specifically so that they integrate symbolically. And so all of it is a piece. But the problem with civilization has always been, and now needs to be recognized. I'm like a doctor of civilization. It was always born anemic. And this next civilization cannot afford to be born anemic. What was anemic about it is that it tended to forget the ritual existential basis of objectivity and to confuse it with the highly integrative, mental, symbolic objectivity, and then to consider the relationship between the two of them subjective. And because the ritual objectivity was conflated with the symbolic objectivity, the only thing left was the subjective vis-a-vis the objective, which was a mental surety. This cripples the entire ecology of everything and makes a skew that shows in the mind, a skew that heads towards abstraction, that corrects everything else in order to fit into its abstract ideation. So that whatever people do, whatever animals do, whatever plants do, have to fit into the ideology of the doctrinal objectivity of a mentality. This is a problem with civilization that was first brought into a focus as a do-or-die phenomenon with the development in ancient Samaria of the confederation of the city-states in ancient Egypt, with the joining of all the nomes of Egypt into the first dynasty, into the Indus civilization, when there were large cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro that constellated the bulk of the power and population. And all of this, about 5,000 years ago, was already recognized. No one knew how to deal with it. And the first people who tried to conscientiously deal with it in a way that we would recognize were the classical Greeks of the 5th century BC. And so they remain for us a calibration touchstone. They remain for us a citing quality, a frame of reference which we can still today utilize. And we've talked about how two figures in classical Greece, in Athens, Thucydides and Plato, tried to set up, one of them making conscious history available as a form, and the other making philosophic inquiry as a love of wisdom put into an objective form as the answer. And philosophy and history created philosophy, developed as a distillation out of Greek tragedy, and history developed as a constellation, a distillation out of mythology. And the fragility of the classical Greek solutions was that one had to be very, very sophisticated and very limited in order to make use of their solutions. And as soon as you started to expand and become in contact with cultures other than that classical Greece, the entire resolution capacity of history and philosophy became compromised. They went from the clarity of the late 5th century, early 4th century BC to the complete unclarity of just a century later. And you find in philosophic histories, one talks about the clarity of history and philosophy in the time of Athens, of Thucydides and Plato, and then 100 years later, one comes to this kind of syncretistic, Hellenistic confusion of things. And instead of having the beautiful nude God, one has the anguished pathe of the distorted man. And so that calibration, while serving instructive for us, is largely also a skull and crossbones sign of poison. Because the reliance there is to conflate ritual existence into the objectivity of the mind, and to have that opposed to the subjectivity of experience. And so you get a subject-object split, literally. And I mean split. You get a schizophrenia. You get a built-in schizophrenia into civilization. Not so much into the individual yet, but into civilization itself. And because civilization became schizophrenic, the natural tendency of the mind at that time, of the symbolic, integrative capacity to make doctrines and ideologies at that time, opted for what it will always do, to make the integral more and more powerful, to make the control of the ritual objectivity, which is conceived then as a part of it, more and more controlled. And out of this came the pinnacle of what we would still today call imperial power. The Roman Empire. The Augustan Principate, the Roman Empire, is an imperial power. It's an imperial ideology that controls all of the ritual actions and assumes that it has the right to control those ritual actions a priori. And that the subjectivity of people will have to fit into that, and will have to find a way to fit into that. And what is left out of this consistently is nature. The entire process of nature is ignored as if it were an assumed accomplice. But nature cannot be ignored, is in fact the primordial process, nor is ritual, because it's the primal objectivity, The first form, existence, is the first form. Existentiality, thusness, is the very first form. It cannot be subsumed under the mind because the mind's objectivity is of a different order. True, it's of a higher order, a higher integral, but it is distinct from it. And this brings a great problem, because if ritual objectivity, if existentials, are subsumed under the symbolic mind, then it presumes that its referentiality, its identity, all of its processes that it has established, that its correlations with existentials are true and real, all of this becomes a veil of deception, but not seen as deception at all, but seen as certainty. And so a great deal of what has gone wrong with civilizations about 2,000 years ago came into a huge focus. And such a huge focus that a great deal of this planet dates time by that event. We call this 2004 because it's 2004 years after what was located as the ground center point of that earthquake. The earthquake being the tyrannical taking over of life by the ideological mind in an imperial way. And since that time, in those 2,000 years, there have been many coups attempted and followed by the counter coup. And one has again and again the seesaw back and forth, and each time there's a deepening subtlety to the tyranny, to the point now where it is faced with an intractable problem, because all objectivities are time-bound. They're not just limited by space, they are also limited by time. And when a time dimension of a form runs out, the form dissolves. It no longer has any dynamic basis upon which its spatiality can be generated. And so it literally collapses. This was a problem 2,000 years ago. The problem was the end of time and the beginning of a new time. And what is the new time? How do we date this? How do we calibrate this? And the question then, as the question now, did this ever happen before? And the discovery was, yes, it's happened. And that the first indication that this was a problem of extraordinary order, not just simply a problem. It is the problem. It's the problem of problems. Because if form cannot hold its objectivity in the mind, then the mind melts back into experience, and if experience is just considered subjective, whatever it is that you want to do, you have then the collapse of all symbolic forms into what is called anarchy, into what is called chaos. But what happens is that when the mind loses its ability to maintain its energy form, its objectivity, one doesn't go back to a chaotic experience, one goes back to a suddenly disclosed ritual objectivity of the body. And so, by default, the inheritor of the metronome for calibration becomes the body and not the mind. And because the body, in fact, is the generator of experience, very quickly there is a loggerhead between existence and the assumed experience. And one's own sense of experience becomes questionable in terms of one's body, which is not used to taking the lead point in maintaining the form of objectivity. And so one's own experience enters into a dis-ease with existence itself, and this is called anxiety. That's what it's called. It's anxiety. And if one begins to get a fear added to the anxiety, because the fear is that the body can't handle all of this, how can the body handle all these imperial forms of colossal millions of people and tens of millions of things? The body's not made for that. It cannot do that. Existence is very, very excellent in its way, but it doesn't run empires. And so the anxiety gets an extra added power, and it's called dread. The anxiety is because the body existentially and the experience mythically can't get together. They don't jibe. And the dread comes because one fears that the mind is not going to be able to help. That there is no other integral help coming, and that one is cut off and left alone. And so the body left alone in a state of anxiety with a calibration of dread becomes, the word is alienated. And so existence becomes alienated. And because it has completely forgotten about nature and is anxious about its veracity of experience, is in dread of its own mind, the body becomes cut off, and the alienation becomes zombie-like, almost catatonic, petrified. And so all of these concerns, as you can see, are not soluble psychologically. They're not soluble sociologically. They're not philosophically available for solution. They're not even able to be dealt with adequately, no matter how strong an integral of an ideology or a doctrine, or the doctrine applied to an indoctrination. None of those are capable. The classic wisdom was that the entire ecology of phases that are involved has to be brought into play as a constellation. They have to be choreographed together, and if they are choreographed together, each having its part to play, then there is every opportunity not only for a resolution to come out, but for the entire ecology to achieve health and wholeness. So that in the first century of our era, our aeon, first century AD, the biggest question at that time was, in response to this new imperial Roman ideological establishment. The actual year was 31 BC, when Augustus Caesar took over Egypt. When he took over Egypt and Hellenistic Alexandria, all of it became moot because of a basic discontinuity in it ritually. The discontinuity was simply this. He took over in the name of the Augustan Principate, which was the Roman Empire, but he reserved Egypt for himself personally. And so there was a bind between a ritual substrate that was objectively quite different from the symbolic objectivity. The symbolic objectivity was that the Roman Empire set up in this way should be the most powerful force in the world and should be able to hold the world together in its sway. And at the time, it was a very sure bet that this was so. And despite all kinds of incursions, it was good for 400 more years. But the difficulty is that the ritual objectivity substrate was that of a king individually who has put himself into a time form that when it runs out, he dies. And the dying God is not just a dying God because he dies out because of a natural limitation on his lifespan, but because the next king kills him. That the way the old king is removed is that the young king kills him. The way the old God is removed is that the young God kills him. And so there is a deep, deep, mysterious thing involved that came to a point at the time that the Roman Empire was being made, that the Augustan Principate was being made. And Augustus, having before him the colossal example of the failure of his uncle, Julius Caesar, and Julius Caesar was far more personally capable than Augustus Caesar. And Augustus Caesar knew this. Very few men have ever been personally as capable as Julius Caesar. He could really do it. But Augustus Caesar had an advantage over him. He had a brain trust. Julius Caesar did it on his own brilliance and recognizance. Whereas Augustus, realizing that he was not the man that his uncle was, surrounded himself by the most talented people he could find, the most talented people in the world that he could find. And the inner group, the brain trust around Augustus Caesar, was profound. They were the best people available at the time that one would have known about. And the star of that brain trust was Virgil. Because Virgil was specifically trained all his life to command the way in which languaged experience, imagery, is deeply rooted in the earth, in the ritual existential basis, and that existential basis is able to be transformed and further integrated into symbolic forms. When you look at Virgil's earliest poetry, it's all a kind of a bucolic poetry called the pastorals. It's all into the earthiness of pastoral landscape qualities, and the next group are called the Georgics, and it's all about beekeeping and winemaking and farming and the whole thing of taking the pastoral landscape, which is a Paleolithic orientation, into the Neolithic farming, the handling of plants and animals and people, and then the third level was the Aeneid, the making of an epic that holds the vast civilization together, rooted in the earth, transformed into the man-controlled earth, and then submitted by the imperial power of the man-dominated universe. And so Virgil becomes the most interesting figure of that time except for Jesus. Much more interesting than Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar is like a CEO who is tremendously talented and knows how to run the company, sets it up. But Virgil is the genius behind the scenes. And one of the odd things is that from time to time, Virgil, when there is a crisis in that whole historical development of that civilization, Virgil is tapped. He was tapped by Dante. When Dante realized that something had happened in the 1100s and the early 1200s that had changed the whole tone, the whole temperament, as we would say, of Christian civilization. He, in writing the Divine Comedy, to reinstate what the Aeneid had created, used Virgil as his guide. In the Divine Comedy, Virgil is the guide to Dante himself. The author is the protagonist himself, with the previous author coming in and being a guide for the protagonist. And the way out of hell, the way out of Inferno, is for Virgil to guide Dante. And the way out of the middle ground, the Purgatorio, is for Virgil to guide him. But Virgil cannot guide him into the third culmination, the Paradiso, the celestial order, because he was not Christian. He was born before the Christian era. And so Dante had to find a different guide in the Paradiso, related to the function of Virgil, but not Virgil himself. And who becomes his guide in paradise but his spiritual love woman, Beatrice. And Beatrice becomes the guide. She takes over from Virgil, becoming the guide. And she guides him through paradise. Now, this is an enormously complex thing, because what had happened in the 1100s and 1200s is that the feminine dimension of civilization came rushing to the fore and became, for the very first time since classical antiquity, equal to the masculine. And the reason for this is that at the year 1000, 1,000 years after the Roman Empire was established, at the end of the first millennium, at the beginning of the second millennium, get how they're always pairs, and it's always in the center of the pairedness that one finds the, not just the margin of relationality, but one finds the edge of proportion. And in the year 1000, the European kings and barons and nobles decided that they were going to go back and reconquer the Holy Land, the Crusades. These lands should not belong to either Jews or Muslims. They should be Christian. And so the Crusades were mooted in the year 1000, but it took a while in those days. The 1000s didn't mobilize very well, and it took quite a long time for them to mobilize. And the first crusade was not very effective, and so they had to retool and redo. And they finally learned that they had to school young men to be more efficient killers and to obey larger structures of command, because the Muslim troops were very experienced at working with large masses of people. And so the Christians became more and more involved in military science for the men, for the way boys are raised, and so that they could mount more effective crusades. And finally, they were to the point to where they were very effective, and they reconquered the Holy Land. The kingdom of Acre is almost exactly the same dimensions as the state of Israel today. 900 years ago, it was the same situation. Very same. That's how you know that there are correlations in the aeon. That's how you know that this is a problem of time forms that are only resolvable by restoring the ecology, the double ecology of the whole set into its harmonic. Its civilization is sick with a disharmony, not with bad guys. Something really severe, disharmony. It's not possible to be harmonic. No one's keeping us from it, other than our own incompetence. When most of the men and young men of the nobles were off fighting, the estates were run by the women. The castles, the estates, the vineyards, the distribution, the education of the young fell more and more to the women, and one sees for the first time the rise of an intelligent feminine population in Europe since classical antiquity. And more, what they did was to teach the young men, even though they were being taught how to be warriors, how to kill really well with a sword, how to use a shield, how to use a lance, that all of that was in the highest service to defend the qualities of the feminine, and it was the birth of chivalry. The response to the Crusades siphoning off the men was that the women, left to deal with life, introduced the rituals and symbols of chivalry into time, into that form. And so for the very first time, by 1165, you have a very great poet, French, Chrétien de Troyes, writing Arthurian chivalrous stories and epics. And in the French, you can still find, here's a Chrétien de Troyes, Perceval le Gaulois, or Le Comte de Graal. It's about the Grail. And Sir Percival. Here's a translation that's done by Yale University Press of this. Percival, the Story of the Grail, translated from the Old French. And these are available. You can find this. One of our texts that we're using, From Ritual to Romance, Jessie L. Weston, is extremely interested in all of these things going on. And in her work, she was born in 1850, and by the time she published a first volume in 1906, she was already 56 years old. And when she published a second volume in 1909, 3 years later, she was 59. They're collected together here in a reprint. The Legend of Sir Percival, Studies upon its Origin, Development, and Position in the Arthurian Cycle. Chrétien de Troyes, and then a follow-up. And even to the end of her life, when she finally began, after writing From Ritual to Romance when she was 70, she lived to be 78, and right at the end of her life, she had lived long enough. She had not only studied long enough, but she had become masterful at the choreography of how this whole ecology constellates and how all of these elements are important. One has to be able to go back to the beginnings of civilizations in the Near East. One has to see the Roman things. One has to see the Crusade things. One has to see all kinds of things. And you have to be able to distinguish a ritual objectivity, sequencing, independent of the mind. Later on, the mind can check it out, but it has to be established first, existentially, by ritual. And then it has to be let to generate the experience of imaged feeling, language, which in the Middle Ages was called romance. They didn't call it myth, they call it romances. So from ritual to romance is how it got from the ancient Near East to the medieval transform, when all of a sudden the feminine qualities of integral came to match those of the masculine. And for the very first time, one had an opportunity for very rare individuals to be balanced in their humanity. For women to understand men, as well as men to understand women, eye to eye, as it were. To be able to participate together in their own ways, but together in a single ritual sequence that generated a shared experience, quality, that would lead to minds that were of alike, that they could understand each other. And that their transformed visions then would also be shared. It wouldn't occur to someone to have a vision by themselves, male or female, because this would not be the whole humanity. Whereas a man and a woman together could have a shared vision, and that would be a transformed consciousness that would be realistically accepted in the entire ecology of the integral universe. And so great ideals, as they're called, were born, but they're not ideals. They're achievements of a great complexity that is unknowable until you take the phase structure that we're using here, because without it, there is no chance that one will ever know that you don't know. Because the mind is incapable of understanding it by itself. It can't take it out of itself except by dire circumstance. The only circumstances that take the mind out of itself are absolute fright, absolute ecstasy, or high wisdom. The only ways the mind can get out of itself. You can be frightened out of your wits, you can be ecstatic out of your wits, or you can learn deep wisdom which transforms wit into a deeper humanity, a deeper quality. Those are the only ways out. And the mind fears all of them. It doesn't like fear. It doesn't like ecstaticness. And it certainly doesn't like high wisdom because it shows itself up as to be rather limited. And one of the biggest difficulties in civilization so far is the arrogance of minds not understanding that they have a place, a very important place. They're not the whole thing. They're just 1/8 at most of the ecology, and that's it. Let's take a little break. Come back. Let's come back to Jesse L. Weston for a moment. We're taking a look this morning, and now coming back to it, at the way in which great chunks of time have forms. And when these chunks of time and their defining forms come into some kind of massive revolution, some kind of massive change, everything is brought into question, and the first response of the mind is to power up so that it can control the circumstance better. And because the mind, in powering up, assumes that it is master of the body, it forces the body into an enslaved, doesn't ask any permission, expects the body to respond, and so the mind stresses the body in a sense of raising up the stakes of power and control. And of course, what suffers from this is not just the body, but because the ritual body is the generator of experience, experience goes into a state of anxiety. And we've talked about that this morning. You can listen to the tape and go back over that. And because there is the subsuming of ritual objectivity into mental objectivity, symbol objectivity subsumes it and considers in its own right then it is the only objectivity, and that experience then, because it isn't objective, must be subjective, and it should be controlled. And so the mind tries to control experience. And the only way that it can really have very much input beyond integration as an index to experience is to assume that the body's objectivity is its own, because it's the body objectivity that generates experience. It's a fact. And so a great deal of the difficulty in the whole ecology, not just of learning, but of living as a human being on a more complex level than the Paleolithic, is that all of this becomes moot. And because it's always assumed to be just one scene, it is not understandable, it is not solvable, it's not improvable, and it also is, unfortunately, never real. Never real. Never real at all. There was an existential therapist in the 1930s who originally was a Jungian and then discovered Binswanger and a number of other things, and his name was Medard Boss. And he had a very simple thing. He said the coordinate, the four coordinates together, falls on its side and becomes an X, becomes an unknown. And so in existential therapy, one is in critical anxiety all the time, verging on dread. And the actual fact is, it has nothing to do with trying to think yourself right. It has everything to do with the existential actions that you do right. And then your body, your existence, will be able to generate a quieter quality, a more real quality of experience. It's a fact. But that whole skein of situations is actually minor. Not minor for someone suffering it, but in the universe it's very minor, because when it happens on a planetary scale like we have, it begins to infect everything. Our machines and our projections are all over the star system already. And our capacity to direct conscious dimensions through powerful telescopes goes out now almost to the ends of the universe. And the universe is really a cosmos, it's really alive, and is very aware of us. And it's not a question of just treading lightly, it's a question of being real in a cosmos that knows how to deal with inharmonics. So this is a very big awakening for mankind right now. And you can see that for most people, there's no way to even sustain the ritual of just being able to stay in long enough to learn. Because all of the identified learning procedures are all indoctrination by now. They're all presumptive arrogance on colossal scale. The critique would be a bug list so long that it would be impossible to finish reading it. The critiques that can be leveled are devastating, and they have been for a long time. Even 200 years ago, there were critiques against the situation as it was then, and has changed very little since, that are devastating. We will later on use Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, and the last lines, written 200 years ago. Darker than death or night, to hope, till hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates. This alone is life, joy, empire, and victory. Was a unbounding of Prometheus, because Prometheus bound is the core, it's the first step ritually in the establishment of the classical Greek ethos of form that leads directly to the development of history and philosophy. The Prometheus Bound of Aeschylus was just the first of 3 plays. They were always in trilogies, 1, 2, 3, followed by a 4th little play called a satyr play. That there is a wild eros nib that is necessary to be put directly into the form of very high-powered symbolic integrals. You have to put a joker in the deck, otherwise it leads very quickly to a devolving. And so the satyr play with the trilogy of tragedies was not like a dessert or a healing cream that after you've suffered through the tragic realizations, 1, 2, 3, that then you were made to feel better, but you were shown that the mind that has suffered these tragedies is not at all the arbiter of reality. It is a part of participation in integral reality, but it has no particular dominating sense whatsoever. And that this was always a saving grace. By the way, it was so little understood later on in Roman imperial empire ethos that only 2 satyr plays from antiquity have survived. One by Sophocles and one by Euripides. All the rest of them were literally thrown away, not preserved, because they were considered fluff. Of the trilogy of Aeschylus, only the Prometheus Bound survived. Only 7 plays by Aeschylus out of about 90. Only 7 plays by Sophocles out of more than 100 survived. And they survived because they were used as school textbooks. And a lot of classic things survive because they're relegated to the nursery. The only people that read things like Moby Dick or the Aeneid now are students, high school students. I remember in the 4th year of Latin, of being good enough in Latin in high school to be able to read Virgil well enough to get the massive erudition, the flavor of the complete calm quality that the Aeneid has, like a massiveness. And part of its refinement was that Virgil was completely conscious as an artist, in the Middle Ages he was called a magus. He was the master magician of all time. He's like a forerunner of Merlin. Where Merlin makes King Arthur, Virgil made Augustus Caesar. He made the context, the magical context out of which the Roman Empire gelled, but his model was Homer. And in Homer, with his pair of epics, you have a pair that has disparate qualities. There was a Irish-born classicist W.B. Sanford, who did a little book called The Sound of Greek, and he recorded Homer and Euripides and Aristophanes. And when he read the Iliad by Homer, the cadence of the hexameter in the Iliad is so somber as to be almost unbearable in its measured, masculine, exclusive definiteness. Whereas when he read the same iambic, the hexameter of Homer in the Odyssey, right away the lilt of the Odyssey is feminine all the way through. Somebody said the Iliad's cadence is that of a huge gray battleship being launched in a fog. And its only purpose is to show that we are good at killing. The Iliad's about the wrath of Achilles. You cross me, I will kill you. And not just that, I will drag your body around your home into shreds, which is what the Iliad is all about. Whereas the Odyssey is about when you have faced that, how do you get back home? Can you get back home? Can you come back into life? Can you come back and live with people again? I remember in the Vietnam War of counseling in Berkeley, the World Without War Council in Madison, Wisconsin. And we would counsel 20-year-old Wisconsin farm boys who at 19 were sent to Vietnam for a year to kill, and then were expected to come back and be good American boys again. And they could hardly stand to be in their skin, because they had not just killed in war, they had murdered. So that the Iliad and the Odyssey had that quality, and when Virgil was setting up under aegis from Augustus Caesar, the Roman Empire, the imperial tyranny, greatest of all time up until that point, it was Virgil looking back at Homer to find a way to bring in the fact that life involves murder, but it also involves a murder in order for life to continue. One has to die to live again. And that the dynamic of life requires that the form of energy change, and that the old king must be killed by the new king. And the new king is made by his ability to kill the old king. And the entire sequence of that was illustrated by a very famous British artist named Turner. And Sir James George Fraser's The Golden Bough is all about this painting by Turner. And this painting by Turner is from Virgil. It's from Virgil's discussion of the priesthood of Lake Nemi up in the mountains above Rome. And that the whole cult of ancient kingship was all focused and centered there. Of how the old king, God, must die to let the new king, God, come into his kingdom. And so the Golden Bough is all about all of this. And it is the Golden Bough that is the massive establishment of European anthropology. The editions of the Golden Bough, the very first volume of the big 13-volume set, here all illustrated by the Golden Bough engraved in the cover. The Magic Art. The second volume, Taboo and the Perils of the Soul. And the third volume, Adonis, Attis, and Osiris. Dying gods who are resurrected. And that the whole template of this was done by Fraser, not just simply because he was an erudite scholar, but he was in fact the greatest figure in his age. He was like Darwin, but he was the man who established social anthropology in Europe. And in a 1908 book called Psyche's Task, a discourse concerning the influence of superstition on the growth of institutions, second edition revised and enlarged, to which is added The Scope of Social Anthropology, an inaugural lecture. And he says, this is May 14th, 1908. The subject of the chair, which I have the honor to hold, is social anthropology. As the subject is still comparatively new and its limits are still somewhat vague, I shall devote my inaugural lecture to defining its scope and marking out roughly, if not the boundaries of the whole study, at least the boundaries of that part of it which I propose to take for my province. Strange as it may seem, in the large and thriving family of the sciences, anthropology, or the science of man, is the latest born. The scope of social anthropology, and one will find that just 50 years later, another book, another inaugural lecture, The Scope of Anthropology by Claude Levi-Strauss, the founder of structural anthropology, one of the most sophisticated figures of the late 20th century. Inaugural lecture, Chair of Social Anthropology, Collège de France, January 5th, 1960. It was little more than a year ago, in 1958, that the Collège de France took the decision to create in its midst a chair of social anthropology. Why does it take until 1960 to create a chair of anthropology, social anthropology? Why does it take until 1908 to create a chair of social anthropology? And why was it done at this time, 1908, 1960? These are very exceedingly important times, exceedingly important dates, but for us, we're looking at Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance, and she says in From Ritual to Romance, right in her introduction, she says, some years ago, when fresh from the study of J.G. Fraser's epic-making work, The Golden Bough, I was struck by the resemblance existing between certain features of the Grail story and characteristic details of the nature cults described. Because the Golden Bough goes into time after time after time, things about nature cults, and all of a sudden, she got worried because the evidence was beginning to point up. His first edition of the Golden Bough was just in 3 volumes in 1906. And then a second edition came out in 1907, and then a third edition came out in 1911. But the initial writing of the first preface to the first edition was done in Cambridge, Trinity College, Cambridge, where Fraser was the star, one of the great dons. 8th of March, 1890. He says, for some time, I've been preparing a general work on primitive superstition and religion. Among the problems which had attracted my attention was the hitherto unexplained rule of the Aretian priesthood, that is, the killing of the old king by the new king around the lake of Nemi. And last spring it happened that in the course of my reading I came across some facts which, combined with others I had noted before, suggested an explanation of the rule in question. As the explanation, if correct, promised to throw light on some obscure features of primitive religion, I resolved to develop it fully, and detaching it from my general work to issue it as a separate study. This book is the result. But it was just the beginning. And from 1890 until he began to lose his eyesight and into the First World War era, he enlarged the Golden Bough until it became 13 volumes, authorized a single volume abridgment of it, which went through tens and tens of thousands of copies. And finally, in 1978, a new abridgment was done by Mary Douglas, the Illustrated Golden Bough. And we're going to use Mary Douglas later on. One of her books will become one of our books when we get to a little bit further into the integral, How Institutions Think. Because one of the qualities that comes out in ritual comportment is that there are no individuals. The individual is an idea in the symbolic mind. There are no individuals in existence. Doesn't occur. It is a projection. It is even sometimes a retrojection, but existentially, there's no such thing as an individual at all, outside of the integral symbolic idea of an individual. So the individual is an idea in the mind. But what is even more startling is that there are no individuals in experience either. Experience has no individuals because experience is a process flow and does not have a formality in its structure at all. There are no individuals in feeling, oddly enough, paradoxically. There are no individuals in language. There's no such thing as a word which is individual in language, permanently, statically, certainly, at all. It's a very, very, very big realization and almost a revelation. And there are no individuals in existence. The individual is an idea in the symbolic mind. What is the carrier of experience is the character. The character carries experience and is a part of the flow and is not a thing. It's not a form at all. Character, as we will see when we get into mythology, figures but does not form. What is there existentially is the body, the physicality, the existential. And so ritual is all about existence. And it takes a great deal of unthinking to be able to understand that because existentials are ritually real, and that the rituals are always involving groups and tribes and clans and genders, and there are all sorts of ways to do groups, families, and so forth, that the anthropological investigation on a mature level of ritual begins very frequently with tribes and families. So that one of the really brilliant developers of anthropology, her name was Elsie Clews Parsons. And when she was in her late 40s, after having been a very famous woman and having written some incredibly poignant books, discovered that they were teaching something called anthropology at Columbia, and Franz Boas had been teaching there for quite some time, developing anthropology, and she went in as a very wealthy, matured woman in her late 40s, and she became a student to learn, and because she was absolutely brilliant, it didn't take her long to really develop into one of the world's greatest anthropologists. But she was not a European anthropologist, she was an American anthropologist. European anthropologists are social anthropologists, initially at least, and they can go into physical anthropology later, but they're social anthropologists since the time of Fraser, since the time of Fraser's mentor, E.B. Tyler. European anthropology is called social anthropology, whereas American anthropology is called cultural anthropology. It's a whole different orientation. The social anthropology of Europe is all about the mind being clear about its classification and categories before it goes in, whereas the American cultural anthropology is that you go and live with the people before you even know what's going on. You apprentice yourself to the people in their existence, in their ritual comportment, before you decide what it is that you're seeing and how you're seeing it. So it's a completely different thing. Huge different thing. The European anthropology has within itself a split which came out about the time of the 1930s. And the split that's there is that there is a social anthropology going from Tyler to Fraser to people like Jessie L. Weston, using them in her writings, to the development of one of the greatest of all the European social anthropologists, Bronislaw Malinowski. But directly opposed to Malinowski was a man named Radcliffe Brown, A. Radcliffe Brown. And all of his students, like E. E. Evans Pritchard, were caustic against Malinowski. This guy makes all kinds of sloppiness. He doesn't do the discipline of thinking this through before he goes into these things. And the touchstone for the Radcliffe Brown, Evans Pritchard, Levi Strauss anthropology, social anthropology in Europe is the sociology of Emile Durkheim. And one has to be very precise about these things before you go in. You have to understand classification exactly and precisely before you go messing around. Whereas the American cultural anthropology is completely different from that, and yet, though it's affine to the Tyler, Fraser, Malinowski social anthropology, it has a slightly different flavor to it. The reason being is that Fraser was enormously learned as a classic scholar before he became one of the world's greatest founders of the science of anthropology. He was a classic scholar. He has 6 huge volumes set on translating Pausanias, who was the greatest traveler in antiquity and did all the travel guides all over the classical world. He has a multi-volume set of 5 or 6 volumes on the Fasti of Ovid, on the imperial rituals of the Roman Empire in the time of the Caesars. He has books on Plato and so forth. And so Fraser was an enormously refined classic scholar before he went in. And so you have a classic base to the development of his enormous reading. Fraser was a Scots genius, and they love to go everywhere in the world, and if they can't go everywhere in the world, they'd like to read about everywhere in the world. And Fraser was that kind of a man. He read everything. And his works, about 50 volumes, are all huge tomes. They're all enormously erudite, cultivated, beyond belief. More than just an encyclopedist, a masterful figure. And the Golden Bough is a mine of all the traditions, superstitions, religions, rituals, all over the world, everywhere. Thousands and thousands of pages of it. But the figure who was the last to carry that lineage, Malinowski, was a Pole. He was Polish. And his area of investigation was out in the New Guinea area, above New Guinea and the Trobriand Islands. And he was there when World War I broke out. And because the Germans, shipping, controlled that part of the South Pacific, he couldn't leave. And so he had to stay and live with the natives for 4 years. He couldn't get out, couldn't get off. And so he literally became an islander and lived with the people because that's the only way he could survive. And out of this, he came to realize something that was extraordinary, that these so-called primitive people, their lives depended, because there wasn't that good a hunting. You couldn't just go out and get all your food or gather your food. You had to grow your food. And so the gardens, growing the yams and various things in the Trobriand Islands, were the focus of survival in existence. And so he did a huge 2-volume, Coral Gardens and Their Magic, because the way that these gardens are protected and engendered is through the introduction of magic all the time into the ritual procedures to keep them formed, keep them existentially viable and accurate, and also protect them against other people who are trying to do the same thing and take over your stuff. And so everybody's trying to protect what they have from what everyone else has. And you can understand that this is a very interesting situation. And someone brilliant like Malinowski came to understand that there is a huge thing going on in here ritually, and some of the titles of his books out of this: Sex and Repression in Savage Society. Yeah. That there's something here that one has to look at from the basis of existential ritual. First of all, it doesn't matter what they're saying, what are they doing? And you can't go by what are they thinking, because they're not thinking. They're doing all the time. It's a non-ending tapestry of adjustments in ritual comportment all the time. And because everyone is doing this all the time, there's this scintillating level of human life that permits them to exist, to survive where very few human groups would be able to survive at all. And Malinowski learned to survive that way, learned to exist that way. And so when it came for him to write, the people who are basing themselves on the sociological ideas of Durkheim, the development of preconceived, refined, symbolic definitions and systems before you go in, thought that he was stupid, naive. Whereas a great many of the Americans understood Fraser and Malinowski, and one of the things that kept creeping in on the side, by the time of Ruth Benedict coming along, who was the most brilliant student after Elsie Clues Parsons of the founder of American cultural anthropology, Franz Boas. It's very interesting because Boas, Papa Franz as they called him, almost all of his great students were women. And as a consequence to that, they had a feminine outlook. When they went to the various tribal areas, they were more likely to be accepted because they weren't white men after something. They were seen as women who could participate in the lives, in their lives, that they could understand them. And so one had all of a sudden a huge generation of American women, and of a couple of European men. And the bridge in between these two groups was very largely controlled. Not controlled, but so much as represented by just a couple of women in England. And two of them were taking in this education. One of them is Jessie L. Weston, the other is Jane Ellen Harrison. Jessie L. Weston because she understood that the whole development of all these phases that we've talked about early this morning, these historical epics and chunks, and how they all not just conflate, but they make a very deep complexity that has to be appreciated through the entire ecology of the complexity. And the other, Jane Ellen Harrison, was perhaps the most brilliant woman in the university system at the time. She was at least capable of being in the same intellectual class with Bertrand Russell, so you can understand how brilliant she was. We're looking at Ruth Benedict, who brings American cultural anthropology, and Jessie L. Weston, who develops the Fraser social anthropology to an extent to where one could not only bring the developments of people like Malinowski into juncture with folklore and fairy tales and so forth, but make a contact with the American cultural anthropologists. And all of this means, for the first time since antiquity, there was an ability to look at the rituals of existence from a multiple comparative standpoint that had never been developed before, because even in antiquity, the feminine standpoint was never as developed as the masculine. And so one had a very odd thing. By the time Ruth Benedict in 1934 wrote her Patterns of Culture, notice, not patterns of society, patterns of culture, you had a population of several dozen A+ women who understood that this was a breaking point of civilization that they were involved in. I could see it. And that no one tradition was going to be able to survive, that only a comparative gestalt brought scintillatingly back into vitality was the only possibility out of this, a rebirth of civilization that included the feminine equal with the masculine. And so you had a very, very, very strange thing. We'll talk about it next week. There were 4 problems. Problem one was the objective ritual mystery. What is it? Problem 2 was the objective written bias. What is it? But there was a problem 1B. I call it 1B pre-2. It's in between. And that was the hidden problem. What about mythic experience? Is it subjective? And then it has its pair, problem 0. What about nature? Nature is really mysterious. If it is a mystery, and it has a parallel with experience, then perhaps experience is mysterious also in a very natural way and has never been incorporated into civilization ever. Because the mystery religions in antiquity were always outside. They were like jokers in the deck. They were there, but they were outside of the order. The civilized order never included them. No one ever talked about them because they were forbidden to be talked about. So that nature and experience were always parts of secrets, secret initiations, and never a part of civilization. This next civilization has to have its secrets in everyday life all the time.